Welcome, and thank you for being here at the Catholic Information Center, those in person and those joining us online. My name is Mary Martin. The ministry of this center creates spaces for encounter, dialogue, and community at the intersection of faith and life. We are a ministry of the Paulist Fathers in collaboration with the Catholic Diocese of Grand Rapids. I'm happy to welcome Dr. Bronwen McShea as our guest presenter for the Women of Vision series this evening. Because we're committed to fostering understanding and dialogue, I'd like to offer a few tips for making the most of our time together, especially since we're gathered both in person and online. I also want to take the opportunity to thank you for your contributions toward this program. And we are grateful to the Mission Advance Office of the Paulist Fathers for their grant making this program series possible. Today is the feast day of Saint Therese of Lisieux. She was canonized in 1925, and in 1997, Pope St. John Paul II proclaimed her a doctor of the Church, recognizing her holiness and the influence of her teaching on spirituality. Let us ask for her intercession, that we too may be guided by the little way, loving God with humility, childlike trust, in simple, everyday acts of love. And let us pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. God of love and mercy, you call us to be your people. You gift us with your abundant grace. Make us a holy people, radiating the fullness of your love. Form us into a community, a people who care, expressing your compassion. Remind us day after day of our baptismal call to serve with joy and courage. Teach us how to grow in wisdom and grace and joy in your presence. Through Jesus and in the Spirit, we make this prayer. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. This evening is the second of our 4 presentations in the series Women of Vision, and presents us with the opportunity to explore the proposals in the final document of the recent Synod on Synodality, including acknowledgement and celebration of women's past and present contributions, greater inclusion of female saints, theologians, and mystics in preaching, teaching, and catechesis, full implementation of existing opportunities for women's roles in the Church. We've invited Dr. McShea to introduce us to 3 to 4 women, highlighting the historical context and the gifts that they expressed through their leadership, gifts that are still needed today. Our hope is that you will stop and catch your breath with the recognition that this is my foremother in faith. I have her charism of creativity. I have her gift of generosity. I'd like to share an insight that was shared with us this past summer by Cammie Beecroft. Remembering their story helps us name our own sense of our place in the continuity of faith-filled followers of Christ. We garner a deeper sense of gratitude for these women because we come to recognize that we stand on their shoulders. And in our remembering, it's not uncommon to feel grief as we come to learn these things about women that we didn't know before. We acknowledge that women's stories are not always readily available to us, and that often brings a sense of lament over what has been lost. And as Cami invited us to do, I'd offer that if you're feeling grief or disappointment or anger this evening, anything stirring, to welcome it. Breathe with it. Additionally, because we are men and women living in the 21st century and with 21st century sensibilities, we're invited to suspend our judgments, to instead hold curiosity as our main posture. Bronwen McShea is a historian, writer, and speaker. And she is the author of 3 books, including Women of the Church, What Every Catholic Should Know. She writes a column for The Pillar and has contributed reviews and essays to the Wall Street Journal, First Things, America Magazine, and many other periodicals. She has furthermore held research and teaching positions at Loyola University Chicago, Columbia University, the University of Nebraska Omaha, Princeton University, and several other institutions. She holds a Ph.D. in history from Yale University and an M.T.S. in the history of Christianity from Harvard University, where she also completed her undergrad studies. She is based in New York City, not far from her hometown of Cornwall in the Hudson Valley. Dr. McShea will offer her reflection on the lives of women in the Middle Ages. And I give you Dr. Bronwen McShea.
So much. Thank you, Mary, for that really kind introduction and also the chance to join you all in prayer. Thanks also to Mark and the Catholic Information Center for inviting me to speak to you as part of this Women of Vision series. As a historian of women's contributions to and experiences in the church in past times, I was really delighted to learn of this series. So I'm honored to get to lead the session tonight. And I'll tell you, this is the closest I've gotten so far to Grand Rapids. I've been to your state, but not yet Grand Rapids. Hopefully someday I'll get there in person. So I'm happy to be Zooming in from New York. I'm going to highlight 4 women of different states of life who exercised leadership and various other gifts on behalf of the church and who lived in medieval times. 3 of them are saints of the church, and one of those is a doctor of the church. But the 4th is not a saint or even up for canonization, but she is someone I believe more Catholics today could benefit from knowing about. So let me preview really quickly the names and just basic details about the 4 women I've chosen before I get into the presentation about each one. So first, I'm going to tell you the story of Saint Radegund of Thuringia. She lived in the 6th century. That's very early on the medieval side. She was forced into an unhappy marriage when she was very young, but she was able then to serve God and exercise her gifts of leadership, love of the poor, and love of learning as the foundress of one of the earliest monastic communities for women in Europe. Second, I'm going to tell you about a 10th century saint, Saint Adelaide of Italy. She was the first Holy Roman Empress in a long line of such women to be consecrated as such by the Pope in a special ceremony. And she used her high position and gifts, including her faithful love of her husband, son, and grandson, all of whom became emperors in her lifetime, to serve the church at a time when it needed reform and renewal and the participation of lay people in that project. Third, I'll tell you about Saint Hildegard of Bingen, an incredibly gifted Benedictine nun. She was an abbess, a mystic, a preacher at times, a writer, a scholar, a composer of sacred music. She was really a polymath. She was a sort of a genius at many things. She lived most of her long life in the 12th century, and she is the doctor of the church that I said I would cover this evening. And finally, I will highlight a late medieval laywoman who is not a canonized saint or even beatified, but who I believe was a good woman of the Catholic Church. She was very gifted, especially in the area of learning and communicating with others. And this is Christine de Pisan. She was an Italian-born woman of the late 14th and early 15th centuries. And she ended up working in the French royal court as a writer when she was widowed and raising her children. So without further ado, let me start with the story of Saint Radegund of Thuringia. I have slides as I go along. Make sure they're working. One second. There we go.
There you go.
Very good. Okay. Mostly pictures. I like to use illustrations, especially when we have beautiful images from the past that we can use. So Saint Radegund, she lived in the 6th century from around the year 520 to 587. And she was a princess from the Germanic kingdom of Thuringia, which is located in what is today central Germany. Now, like many girls from ruling families at that time, she was forced to marry at a young age. She had no choice in who she was marrying. And shockingly, she was only 10 years old when pushed into a political marriage with the then 33-year-old Frankish king Clothar I, who in fact made her marry him after defeating her uncle named Hermanfrid and conquering Thuringia. So this was not a happy situation. Now, sadly, although King Clothar I was actually the son of a pious woman who's honored as a saint of the church, Saint Clotilde, who helped convert his father, King Clovis, the first Christian king of what would become the Kingdom of France, Clothar himself was not himself a good Christian man. He was impious. He kept many women around him. He was cruel to his very young bride. He even killed her brother in another power grab when she was about 25. So she really went through a lot of traumatic experiences. Now, unlike other women of her time who were similarly trapped in situations like this, she was able to do something that would end up really having great consequences for the still emerging Christian society of early medieval Europe. She successfully fled this marriage to become a nun. And she was able to do this thanks to the help of a good bishop named Medard, who stood up to King Clothar on her behalf and provided her with his protection. Now, we know about Saint Radegund's life in part because of an account penned by Saint Venantius Fortunatus in the 7th century. He was himself a bishop, as well as a poet and a hymn writer, and he's actually one of the lesser-known Latin fathers of the church. And we learn from Venantius Fortunatus that Radegund persevered through her great trials, and with her strong faith and other gifts from God, such as her courage and leadership ability, she founded her own monastic community with the help of Bishop Medard. And this was the Abbey of Sainte-Croix, or the Abbey of Holy Cross, in the French city of Poitiers. And the sort of ruins of that original building are still visible in Poitiers in France today. I have a photo showing some of the part of that original building. And there she implemented a monastic rule where women took the 3 vows of religious life: poverty, chastity, and obedience, and they lived behind cloister walls. Now, I have an interesting quote from Saint Venantius's text, which I'm paraphrasing slightly here and there just to make it a little clearer. So this is a quote from the time period. From the time she was veiled and consecrated by Saint Medard, she ate nothing but legumes and green vegetables, not fruit nor fish nor eggs. And she drank no drink but honeyed water or perry, which is cider made from pears, I learned after reading this quote. And she would touch no undiluted wine nor any decoction of mead or fermented beer. So she did not drink as much wine as I do, certainly, that's for sure. Now, throughout the whole of Quadragesima, which is what Lent was often called in those times, she ground fresh flour with her own hands. She continuously distributed each offering to local religious communities in the amount needed for the meal taken every 4 days. With that holy woman, acts of mercy were no fewer than the crowds who pressed her. As there was no shortage of those who asked, so there was no shortage in what she gave. So she was very generous with what the monastery had. Now, following St. Radegund's example and drawing inspiration from her various gifts of ascetic discipline, love of the poor, etc., the women in her community followed a strict diet that we would call vegan today and served the socially marginalized in various ways. And furthermore, as they were blessed by various financial resources that Radegund and other women brought into the community, they became devoted to almsgiving too. And this is in a context where there are no, there's no social safety net in early medieval Europe. So these monastic gifts to the local population are really some of the first real charity that anyone ever experienced in some of these contexts. Now, St. Radegund had a love of learning as well. Something that, as a scholar, I think is moving to think that she held on to and developed despite all the suffering she went through in her youth. So also following her lead, the nuns in her community engaged not only in prayer and contemplation and service to the poor, but also in reading, writing, copying manuscripts, and other intellectual and artistic tasks. And one testament to the learning and writing nurtured in Radegund's community is the fact that a much younger woman of the community named Baudevinia in time wrote the first full-length life of St. Radegund, using a manuscript of St. Venantius and some of her own memories and interviews with older nuns as her sources. So according to the pioneering women's historian, Gerda Lerner, quote, Baudevinia depicted Radegund as an outgoing woman, nurturant and solicitous of her nuns, and deeply concerned with her role as a peacemaker among warring kings. Further, I just want to add that Baudevinia's Vita Radegundis is one of the first known biographies of a woman written by another woman, setting a precedent for many other religious women residing in medieval convents to produce similar accounts of their communities' foundresses and other important leaders. But returning to St. Radegund herself again, I want to add, in relation to her love of the poor and the marginalized, that she developed a reputation for healing as she took in sick and dying people into the convent to care for them. And strikingly, for someone still honored by many in her time as Queen of the Franks, so she left her husband, but she was still technically Queen of the Franks. She nevertheless, despite being the highest ranking woman of her kingdom, as a nun, she actually submitted herself to the authority of another nun named Agnes, who was the abbess of the community. So she had the gift of humility and sort of a sense of each person has a different kind of leadership they should be exercising, as well as the gifts of leadership herself, and I think many other gifts that I think her story shows that she had. Now, the second medieval woman that I want to tell you about was much more happily married, at least the second time around, than St. Radegund. She was married twice, and she never left her ordinary lay state of life to become a nun, but actually rose up to become one of the most powerful and influential female Catholic rulers of early medieval times. And this is because she's the first woman consecrated by a pope as Holy Roman Empress, with a special ceremony of consecration that was distinct from the consecration of the emperor. So this is Saint Adelaide of Italy, and she's sometimes known by the more German version of her name, which is Saint Adelheid of Burgundy. Now, like Saint Radegund, Saint Adelaide was born into a royal family, and this was around the year 931. Her parents were King Rudolph II and Queen Bertha of Burgundy, a kingdom that straddled portions of today's France and Switzerland. Also, like Radegund, she had her share of suffering as a girl and young woman, but she persevered through her trials and eventually exercised great courage and even daring, I would say. So let me explain. And by the age of 6, Adelaide had lost her father and in time was required by others close to her, including her mother's new husband, King Hugh of Italy, to marry her own stepbrother named Lothar. And she was 15 and he was 20. Then by 17, Adelaide was herself Queen of Italy because her husband Lothar became King of Italy when his father died. And so this gave her sort of an ample position in 2 different kingdoms, especially in Italy. A year after this, she had her first child. This is a daughter who was named Emma. But events prevented young Queen Adelaide from settling into any kind of normal life with a young family, at least normal for a royal family in the 10th century. So in the year 950, her husband, King Lothair, died suddenly, very likely by poisoning by someone working for the powerful, ambitious nobleman Berengar of Ivrea, who really wanted to rule Italy himself. Now, hoping after this to secure his claim to the throne of Italy by having his son Adalbert marry Adelaide, who was now exceptionally wealthy as the young dowager queen of Italy, and who also was exceptionally beautiful and intelligent by various accounts, he soon found himself instead locked in a battle of wills with this very young woman, this young widow and new mother. She refused to oblige. So Berengar actually imprisoned Adelaide inside the castle at Lake Garda in Verona. And I have a modern photo of Lake Garda. And there's the castle itself where she was imprisoned. I couldn't find any good photos of that, but this gives you a sense of the scenery that we're talking about. Now, here is where we see Adelaide's courage and even daring in full force as she's sort of thrown into prison by this nefarious nobleman. So after several months in captivity at Lake Garda, Adelaide, with a female servant she was allowed to have with her, and the additional help of a rather swashbuckling priest who was allowed to give her confession and communion, she actually dug a tunnel with them beneath the ground at the castle and escaped. And they escaped. The guards didn't notice them leave. And as day broke, the night they escaped, Adelaide and the others, they hid in caverns and in the furrows of grain fields to avoid the pursuers. Now, King Berengar followed her, but he did not find her. Queen Adelaide, her maid, and the priest then connected with a bishop, the Bishop of Reggio, and a young nobleman who defended her against Berengar's troops. And then suddenly, to Berengar's surprise, the powerful and apparently relatively charming and newly widowed king of Germany, named Otto, descended into Italy with an army, scaring Berengar away, who did not even attempt to fight them. And Otto and Adelaide then rendezvoused with their respective entourages at Pavia, which had been taken by Otto, and they married each other. And this marriage came about, I want to stress, because 19-year-old Adelaide had actually proposed to the 39-year-old Otto and not vice versa. She wanted to marry him and she wanted to kind of join forces with him against these enemies. And we know this in part because another of the earliest female historians that we know by name, a 10th century German canonist named Hratzvita of Gandersheim, underscored this fact that she had proposed to him, not vice versa, in her work Gesta Autonis, as one of the many things for which Adelaide deserved praise and the gratitude of her people. Also, with Adelaide's encouragement, her new husband Otto claimed the crown of Italy at Pavia at Christmas time in 951, and the two would go on to have 2 surviving children, a daughter named Matilda and a son named Otto after his father. Now, when Adelaide married Otto, she understood that with the domains and wealth she brought into the marriage, that he had a strengthened chance with her at his side of one day being crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in Rome. This was something that the different rulers in Europe were competing for. And that day eventually came 11 years into the marriage in 962. Significantly, though, Adelaide herself was also crowned and consecrated by Pope John XII in an unprecedented way for a Christian queen up to that time. She was crowned as Holy Roman Empress and consecrated in a kind of, it's not a sacrament, but a sacramental-like ceremony. And she was made co-ruler of her husband Otto's empire. Indeed, this new ceremony of consecration was employed by the Pope when crowning her in a way that it was believed gave her a kind of sacred authority alongside her husband, and one that linked her to a long line of sacred queenship going back to the biblical Esther. And with that special consecration by the Pope, she was expected to employ her position on behalf not just of her people's material needs and security, but on behalf of their spiritual needs, in part by protecting the church and encouraging Christian faith and virtue generally in the realms that she co-led with Otto. Now, St. Adelaide, and I should point out the statues I have here of Adelaide and Otto were made much later. There are no good contemporary images, but they were celebrated figures for many centuries, so we have kind of later depictions of them. Adelaide appears to me to have been quite gifted at multitasking, as we would put it today. So as Holy Roman Empress, Adelaide had numerous public duties, including obligations to represent her husband and make administrative interventions for him around the empire while he was away at war, and he often was, or while he was busy in another part of the empire. So they both traveled a lot. She dispensed gifts from the royal treasury to various institutions, including ecclesiastical institutions. And she furthermore was expected to raise her children, especially her son, who would inherit his father's throne, as both capable future rulers and pious, merciful, and generous Christian leaders. Adelaide's commitment to that latter goal, which was part of her primarily maternal as well as regal duties, and her commitment to a life of Christian virtue and prayerfulness generally, were noted a number of times by observers during her lifetime, which is a reason she became a candidate for sainthood right away. She stood out to some of the chroniclers of the time as exceptionally committed to her faith and to these sorts of duties. Now, what's more, Adelaide would go on to use her papally sanctioned powers as empress to strongly favor what is remembered as the Cluniac monastic reform. And the Cluniac monastic reform is the most famous reform of kind of lax, corrupt monasteries in Christian history prior to the reforms of the post-Protestant Reformation period. And her support of an abbot named Saint Maiolus of Cluny was crucial to his success as a leader of this movement, which in time successfully reformed and reinvigorated many monastic communities that had grown lax and even corrupt. And this reform also involved establishing new monasteries, which were oriented to the spiritual betterment of all Christian society, not just the holiness of the members of the communities themselves. There was a belief that if you spread good monastic communities, that the sort of piety and the holiness and discipline and generosity of these places would spread outward into the rest of society. And that this was something Adelaide very much believed in and encouraged. So it was Adelaide's choice, for example, to give Saint Maiolus of Cluny the monastery and church of San Salvatore in Pavia, which she had recently seen rebuilt, and it became a center of the reform movement in northern Italy. Now, in 973, Adelaide was widowed once again, this time for good. So her husband Otto died from a fever. He was only 60. Her son, Otto II, now became the ruler, and he became emperor as well. He was only 18. So his mother, who was 41, remained in power alongside him as regent for about a year, until a group of politically ambitious counselors convinced the emperor to send his mother away. However, Adelaide nevertheless was able to maintain control because of her first marriage over a lot of royal territories of her own in northern Italy. And so she still held on to vast estates, various abbeys, many ecclesiastical institutions, and she was able to continue her commitment to the reform of the church in these places. while her son was emperor. Unexpectedly, though, her son Otto died at only 28, so she suffered a lot of loss in her life. He got very sick during an outbreak of malaria in Italy. Now, a duke tried to take over the empire as regent, but Adelaide had the support of most of the ranking churchmen in Italy and others in the empire, and so Adelaide once again took the reins as regent instead of this powerful Duke of Bavaria that wanted to control these lands. So from 984 to 991, she then governed the Holy Roman Empire again, this time on behalf of her young grandson, Otto III. And she actually drew assistance from her daughter Matilda, who was by this point a powerful abbess, as well as a princess. And her daughter actually was an abbess with some considerable control of certain ecclesiastical institutions in her domains of her abbey, which is quite interesting. It's kind of part of a medieval setup of kind of a mix of royal and ecclesiastical power that we see a lot in medieval times, which was used for good and for ill. I think in Adelaide's case and her daughter's, mostly for good. So her daughter actually became an important Christian leader as well as an abbess. And I think the story of her daughter, Matilda, I think reflects very well on her upbringing by her mother, St. Adelaide, who appears to have exercised many gifts in her family, as well as in her more public duties. There's Otto III, her grandson. So the period of her regency as her grandson Otto's kind of regent, and as he came of age, is seen by historians as a time of relative peace and stability in the empire after a lot of wars. In no small measure due to her ability, which was noted by many chroniclers, to intervene diplomatically, to bring people to the table and to achieve peace with each other. Some of her interventions as regent involved restoring lands and goods that were taken during wartime, properly belonging to monasteries. So a lot of monasteries suffered during these wars, and she made sure that restitution was made. And she also made sure that generous assistance was given to poor and displaced people who suffered as a result of the wars in the previous years in the empire. Now, even after her grandson was deemed old enough to rule on his own, he regularly involved his grandmother. He depended on her, who loved and protected him as much as she could. And so she participated in high-level decisions, especially regarding the ongoing reform of monastic institutions in the empire, which she always cared about. And so there's more details I could say about that, but I'll skip past some of those so I can move on. She ended up dying at a place called Seltz Abbey in Alsace. This was a Benedictine abbey for men that she had actually founded as regent in 991. And she secured this abbey papal protection. So because she was their main patroness, she had her own space there, and that's where she spent her final days. So she died there on December 16th, 999. She almost made it to the year 1000. And for several centuries, her relics were very lovingly preserved at that monastery before being transferred to a nearby church named for St. Stephen. So let me pause there, take a drink of water. Now I want to move on in time here to the 12th century. And I would like now to tell you about one of the great abbesses and mystics of medieval Christendom. This is St. Hildegard of Bingen, whose longtime status as a saint was fully formalized in the year 2012 by Pope Benedict XVI. And she was also that same year declared to be a doctor of the church that year, making her only the fourth woman ever to be honored with that title. Now, St. Hildegard of Bingen, we'll see, was very gifted in many ways. Indeed, she's considered a bit of a polymath, as well as an effective leader and even preacher at times. But long before her gifts were apparent, She was just a tiny baby born in the year 1098 in Bemersheim in the Rhineland in Germany, a beautiful region. I actually lived in Rhineland and Mainz for a year when I was a postdoc. And so she lived in the Rhineland, which is in the same, at the time, was in the same German empire that St. Adelaide and her husband, son, and grandson had governed a century before. Now, Hildegard was born into a family that seems to have been relatively well connected and probably of noble lineage, meaning in that era of landowning and warrior elite ancestry. And actually, in those days, typically women who became nuns tended to come from noble families. There's a complicated history behind that. So it's presumed that she was of noble family, but not much is known about her family, except that she was the youngest of 10 children. And as was common for younger children in large families, even of noble families in those days, her parents sent her away when she was very young, in her case, the age of 8, to train for a religious vocation. It was very common to kind of set aside 1 or 2 or even more of a family's children for a religious vocation. And in their case, though, they entrusted her with a woman named Jutta of Sponheim, who lived a half-day's journey away from them in a place called Dissebodenberg. And Jutta of Sponheim was an anchoress, meaning she didn't live in a monastery with other women or convent. She lived on her own in her own private space dedicated to prayer and study. And anchoresses like this, they had a lot of learning. They had a lot of gifts of prayer that they had and discipline in prayer, and they liked to train apprentices basically so that when they passed away, there'd be another anchoress there. And so this is what Hildegard was chosen to be, the apprentice to Jutta of Sponheim. Now, fatefully, though, around the year 1112, when Hildegard was living with Jutta, studying, praying with Jutta, she was just a teenager, a local men's Benedictine community convinced Jutta to form a sister community to basically expand and become a Benedictine community of women, to invite other women and form a convent. So Jutta agreed to this, and within a few years, Hildegard, instead of becoming an anchoress, professed vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience as a Benedictine nun, living in a larger community with other women, something that would greatly shape the course of her life from that point forward. Now, years later, in her 30s, Hildegard was elected abbess. Although she was sometimes ill, she was energetic as an abbess. She was talented at administrative duties, and she was very devoted to her spiritual exertions. Now, her natural charisma and leadership abilities made her religious sisters and many others admire her and trust her with leadership of the community. Now, in addition to this, Hildegard received from God the rather exceptional gift of mystical experiences. So she had rather direct encounters with God in her prayer, very palpable kind of, and she had visions during her times of prayer. And a lot of this came as she was in midlife. And a great turning point came for her with a vision she experienced at the age of 42. And she wrote down what the experience was like in this way. She said, quote, "A blinding light of exceptional brilliance flowed through my entire brain. And so it enkindled in my whole heart, and it kindled my whole heart and breast like a flame." So she felt herself kind of on fire with God's illuminating presence. And after this, her understanding of the Psalms, the Gospels, and other biblical texts, which she'd been studying since childhood, seemed to her to increase even more. So they deepened profoundly. So she became conscious of kind of new gifts of understanding, levels of understanding, coming to her as gifts from God through her times of prayer. And she also heard a command from God in this same experience while she was praying. And that command was, say and write what you see and hear. Now, Hildegard was initially very afraid of this command that she heard, say and write what you hear, because it's one thing to be a nun in a convent, studying and praying with other women. It's quite a different thing, especially in those days, for a nun in a convent to go out and start talking about visions, talking about God in an authoritative way, and writing down her ideas into books. Now, partly because she was a woman without formal training in theology, which was open to clergymen who got to go to universities or study in other ways more formally, she knew that some church authorities would scrutinize her and possibly accuse her of heresy if she wrote about divine matters. And I think she also simply doubted that she was equal to the task that of writing about God. And we have evidence from her own writings that she doubted herself and her abilities. And she doubted herself so much, she actually fell sick as she struggled with these doubts. But then she found the courage to begin writing a work that she entitled Scivias, or that's what it's known as. Scivias is part of a Latin phrase that translates as know the ways of the Lord. Now, some clergymen learned what she was up to and were indeed disapproving, but several powerful churchmen actually supported what she was doing, including Heinrich I, the Archbishop of Mainz, who was so impressed with the Scivias, this text she was writing, that he urged the Pope, Eugene III, and I have an image of Pope Eugene or Eugenius III there. And the Pope read this part of the text that she was writing, and he was also so impressed that he encouraged Hildegard to finish the book and to even write more and to even engage in some public preaching and in kind of public spaces. Now, Pope Eugene had been a Cistercian monk before he was Pope. He was a mentor to Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who was an abbot and mystic who had founded the Crusading Knights Templar. Now, Pope Eugene was actually influenced by the same Cluniac reform movement that I had told you St. Adelaide of Italy had encouraged when she was alive. So Pope Eugene's pontificate in some ways was one of the fruits of that Cluniac reform. And Pope Eugene, in that spirit, encouraged Hildegard in her work. So he was, like the Cluniac reformers, he was committed to the reform of lax clergymen and monastics in Christendom. And he also sought the elevation of the church's spiritual and intellectual life. And he saw Hildegard as a very helpful person to work with him toward these goals. So with the Pope's support, Hildegard became more well-known. So she founded another community of Benedictine women because more women wanted to join. This is close to Disibodenberg, and this was on a hill near the town of Bingen in Germany. And based there, she exercised faithful and effective leadership inside and outside her convent. And she sometimes traveled. She preached throughout the Rhineland and other parts of the Holy Roman Empire. She corresponded as well with powerful people, including several popes, with St. Bernard of Clairvaux, with Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was the Queen of England, with the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. And she gave spiritual advice to these very powerful people who trusted her. And some of these figures wrote to her after learning of her wisdom and her effective teaching and her gift for spiritual counsel. Now, over time, she wrote a lot. Her teachings, drawn from her mystical visions, underscored the goodness of all God's creation, as well as the majesty of human beings, because we are made in God's image and likeness. And in one of her works, Liber Divinorum Operum, the Book of Divine Works, she emphasized the ability of human beings to access the divine by means of the physical senses. And I have a quote from her here. She writes, "Man rules the rest of creation, for man is distinguished by the insignia of Almighty God. These insignia are the 5 human senses through which, by God's power, a person understands and perceives that the Trinity in unity and the unity in Trinity ought to be worshipped in God through the right faith." And there are quotes like this where she kind of emphasizes the kind of majesty of human beings as sharing in God's kind of divine powers in some way, insofar as they are made in the image and likeness of God and they honor God's will for them, that God sort of generously shares kind of rule over creation with human beings whom he loves, especially through Jesus, his son. Now, here and elsewhere, Hildegard is seen as counteracting a heresy that was spreading at the time, a heresy that was associated with a group called the Albigensians or the Cathars. And these heretics had a dualistic view of reality. They saw evil as a substantive rival force alongside God and his goodness, rather than as the deprivation of the good, which is the orthodox understanding of evil, that evil is the absence of God, the absence of good. It's not kind of a substance that rivals God. And the Albigensians also associated creation's physical aspects, such as human and animal bodies, also the sexual acts required for reproduction. They associated these things with evil. Hildegard, as a nun committed to her perpetual virginity and her religious vows, including to chastity, defended human sexuality as integral to the complementary nature of our creation by God as male and female. And she also contributed to understandings of the human person as a unity of body and soul. Whereas the Cathars, I think they like to see the body and the soul as kind of separate and almost more at odds with each other. Now, in addition to writing about theological matters, Hildegard wrote about medical and other scientific topics. She composed poetry and music and directed artistic nuns in paintings that represented her visions. And these works of art, and I have two samples of these up on the screen, painted by the nuns in her community, are really some of the most striking that survive from medieval times. They're kind of hard to understand. There's many of them. If you look up Hildegard Bingen and images, the paintings of her visions, you'll find more of them online. She did not paint them herself, but she directed others in painting to kind of represent what she saw. Now, despite periods of poor health, she lived to the age of 81. And when she died in 1179, she was mourned by many people who believed she was a saint. And numerous Catholics in German lands continued to honor her as a saint for centuries. She was never formally fully canonized, though. So Pope Benedict XVI, who of course is German in background, he acknowledged her longtime informal status as a saint when he elevated her to the full honors of the altar in 2012 in a process that's known as equivalent canonization. And that same year, kind of recognizing her tremendous gifts of various kinds, and also the sort of majesty of many of her teachings and her writings, he declared her to be a doctor of the church, or a saint whose teachings have special weight and authority for the whole people of God. Now, I see time-wise, I don't have that much time left. The last person I'm not going to speak about quite as long, so you allow me, the fourth and final woman I want to highlight now is actually not a canonized saint or even up for consideration for canonization. But I like to always, when I speak, talk about good women of the Catholic Church who are not necessarily among the canonized saints, because there are many of them in history. And Catholics sometimes like to focus only on the saints, and we sometimes don't realize there's a lot of rich history in addition. And so I want to tell you about a woman named Christine de Pizan. And I think her gifts especially were in the areas of kind of exercising her intellect and in communicating ideas to others. And she did, I think, a special service to other Christians in making sure that the contributions of women to history were better understood in her own time. So it's kind of close to my heart, her story. So Christine de Pizan lived from 1364 to 1431, and she had the fortune to be born into a relatively elite family in Renaissance-era Venice, where learning in various subjects was flourishing and where girls were beginning to be, in some cases, educated quite well in certain families. Now, Christine's father, Thomas, was a physician in service to a powerful government official in Venice, and then he was given an even better position as a court astrologer and physician to the King of France. So she moved to France as a girl. And this brought her to Paris when she was young. And by the time she was 14, she was married to a royal secretary named Etienne du Castel. And 14 was a rather normal age for girls to marry, especially from elite families at that time. Now, sadly, her husband died only 11 years into the marriage and a year after Christine's father died. And so Christine was left not only with 3 children to finish raising on her own, but also with some debts to pay off. But unusually for a woman of the time, she was not only very well educated, but she was able to respond to her financial difficulties by earning a living as a writer. This is a very rare thing in that time period, even for men, to earn a living as a writer. So thanks to her connections that her family had, she became a court writer to King Charles V and then young Charles VI of France. And in this role, she wrote poems, including courtly love poems, which were fashionable at the time. She wrote precursors to the novel. She wrote books of advice, especially for other women who were increasingly literate in her world. And she wrote biographical studies, including a biography of King Charles V after he died. Her most famous work, though, is called The Book of the City of Ladies, and it was completed around the year 1405. And whereas the famous 14th century Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, in a collection of stories about great women from history, had focused on women who were reputed to have been sexually immoral, sort of claiming that women couldn't be powerful in history unless they were immoral in certain parts of their life. Christine de Pizan was able, through her own research, to highlight women who were chaste, who were virtuous in various ways, who had mystical encounters, and had some cases been willing to die for God, who had been important in history too. Now, there are English translations of her book available, The Book of the City of Ladies. So you can buy actually an inexpensive paperback if you want to. And the book actually shows how learned and gifted she was in the form of well-crafted narrative writing, rather moving uses of language, and so on. And I just want to share a few lines from the Hackett edition of the Book of the City of Ladies. And toward the beginning of the book, she shares her concern that the more history texts she studied, and the more reading of various philosophers and other learned men of her time that she did, the more she was given the impression by them that women are inherently inferior to men, morally as well as intellectually, and in terms of their ability to perform great as well as good deeds, with virtues like courage and resolve. And things got to such a point in her reflections in this vein that she tells us, quote, "I concluded that God had created a vile creature when he fashioned woman. And I confronted him with these words, 'O Lord, how can this be? Did you yourself not create woman with the utmost care and endow her with all the qualities you wanted her to have? And how could it be that you created her perfectly, and yet I see so many dreadful accusations,'" meaning in the history book she was reading, "not to mention judgments and condemnations, to her detriment." And she even added in the same passage, "Those words and many others that I spoke to God, sick at heart and lamenting in my foolishness how deeply unhappy it made me, that God had put me into this world in a female body." Now, she uses the word foolishness here because in the rest of the book, she develops in a semi-fictional narrative, but drawing a lot from religious and historical literature that she was steeped in, her arguments about how many of the sources she had been reading about women's deeds actually misrepresented many women, or were even unjust to them, and also unjust toward God himself, insofar as he created women alongside men with equal dignity and worth. So it's one of the earliest texts we really see kind of declaring very strongly that women are equal in dignity and worth to men, and that this is God's intention for men and women to sort of both be side by side, working for God's will in the world, in history. So this book was really a wonderfully Christian as well as learned book. I'm going to maybe stop my screen share while I wrap up here, if that works. Quite innovative for its time. And it's quite interesting too, because in it, the author admits that women in her day were inferior at many things, but it was one of the first books to argue in late medieval Christendom centuries before the Enlightenment or even feminism, that this was not a product of nature, but of nurture, of the way women were educated or miseducated at the time. Now, she proposed something else, rather radical, that stemmed from the Christian worldview of the time. She said women's oppression and suffering actually made them better able to live virtuous lives in imitation of Christ. So she wanted women to find in a way they could redeem the sort of injustice toward them, because they could unite their suffering to Christ in a special way as women. And like all things can be used for good to honor God. In short, she suggested that many women were, because of their fidelity to Christ, through a lot of interior, often silent or otherwise thankless suffering, spiritually more advanced than many of the men around them. Now, this book would not necessarily be widely known by lots of people in the centuries after her lifetime, but it was certainly discovered by many people in modern times. And in her own time, I want to say she did influence a lot of women around her, including her own daughter, who became a nun. Her daughter, Marie, became a Dominican nun, and she influenced various princesses and other high-ranking people that she knew. And I think her contributions and just her simple presence also opened doors to other women to be writers in her time period. Now, I hope that the various gifts of the 4 women I presented stories about are relatively clear to you, or perhaps in the discussion, you can point out gifts that maybe you see that I did not articulate, or which they share as a group. And I'm really eager to hear some of your reactions to these 4 women's stories as I presented them. But let me just close here with the fact that the more that I come to learn about such women myself as a historian, but also as a Catholic laywoman of our times, the more that I become very conscious how much God has gifted so many women as well as men in very particular ways that have the power to do so much good in the lives of those around them and on a spiritual plane, and more widely within and for our church and in our world. And I also see these women themselves as great gifts to me and to the church, even of modern times. Because really, what a wonderful thing it is to realize that women like this are among our many foremothers in the Catholic faith and in the Christian pilgrimage that is our life here on earth as we're seeking and awaiting the blessings of heaven. So thanks very much. And I'm sorry if I went a bit over time. I kind of lost track. So thank you so much.
Comments, thoughts, friends? What would you like to ask? What do you want to say? We're speechless. We're speechless.
Oh,
No.
okay. Okay.
I guess I just want to say you did a great job of introducing. I mean, I knew about Hildegard, right?
Mhm.
But the other ones, not so much,
Mhm.
especially the last lay woman, and
Mhm.
giving that opportunity to see the different ways. You know, they
Mhm.
weren't all just leaders. They weren't all just powerful. They weren't all just writers, but it was the gifts they shared, but also it seemed their care for the poor and their compassion that actually was a strength. It ended up being quite a strength, even when they were leading, even when they were influential. So thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I sort of see their experiences as well in a way become gifts in the way that they kind of turn them to good purposes, right? So I think sometimes experiences are not always feeling like gifts when we're in the middle of them, right?
Right.
But with faith, you can sort of go back and kind of reorient certain things in your life for good, right? So
Beautiful.
I
Yep.
I thought it was quite interesting that this program was coming off of the Feast of Saint Therese today of Lisieux. So I thought that was kind of cool. Another doctor of the church, but I didn't know that women of that time really had that kind of affluence, coming into their vocation, essentially. Whereas a lot of times you would have thought that women came from more impoverished backgrounds into monasteries or to,
Right.
cloistered situations. But
Right.
that was something that I found interesting, that all of these
Yeah.
women came from some, affluence.
Yeah,
And
and
I just wondered if
sorry.
you could comment on
Sure.
other women who did not come from
Mhm.
affluence in medieval times, but became great leaders.
Sure. Yeah. So there are two things just I want to say quickly. One of the problems we have with earlier medieval times, there are not that many writings. Like there are lots of writings, but compared to modern times, there are far fewer. And they tend to focus on the chronicles of powerful people. So we tend to just know more about these wealthier women because they're the ones spoken about by name in the writings, including sometimes by other women. As we see, people don't realize women were sometimes writing these chronicles too. Also, over time, it became especially becoming a nun in a cloistered, a true monastic setting, like becoming a Benedictine or a Dominican nun as opposed to a tertiary. There was an expectation, and it continues well into modern times, that you bring a dowry into that the same way you would into a marriage. So it tended to be women of some means could become nuns, and that, unfortunately, and it got worse over time, excluded women who did not have means. Those without means could become nuns if they had a patron give their a dowry to the convent. So you could acquire a dowry. Married women sometimes had patrons, when they brought a dowry into the marriage, would get support from a patron in order to marry well, even if they didn't come from a rich family themselves. So there were a lot of sort of thick networks developed of people helping each other when they didn't have the means in some Christian contexts. We don't really see kind of women of more humble backgrounds kind of leaping off the pages of history as leaders until more the high Middle Ages. Someone like Catherine of Siena, she didn't come from a poor background, but her father was an artisan in Italy. She becomes a tertiary, not a nun. And there are other tertiaries, women who joined what were called beguinages in various parts of Europe, which were less formalized than convents. And you were free to come and go, be a member for a few years and then leave, and still maybe help your family. Women from more humble circumstances sometimes couldn't become nuns because their families depended on their work at the family workshop or their participation on the farm to kind of help support the family. So in a way, it was a luxury for some to become nuns and leave the family circle like that. So I could go on and on. It's very complicated medieval history, but the church kind of evolves in different ways in these settings.
So was there one more question, and then
Mhm.
I'll move on for other people. But what about corruption? Like you read about the difficulty with so many monasteries with monks, male monks in the monasteries, leading to corruption of the monasteries because of wealth. Did that happen in the monasteries of
Yeah, for women.
yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not talking about the early modern period, but a famous case of this is the the um the Carmelites in Spain. Teresa of Avila becomes a Carmelite, and it's a rather lax environment. The cloister rules are totally not enforced. People are having guests. Rich nuns have their friends and family coming, hanging out with them. They're not necessarily doing their prayers. They're not living poverty in any way. Um, and her great legacy in the church is to have reformed the Carmelite order. She had to reestablish a new Carmelite order, the Discalced Carmelites, to do that. So women's communities were certainly affected by kind of just falling into worldliness, sometimes worse forms of corruption. Um, I tend to caution people. We have a bit of in modern times, we're so accustomed to church and state being totally separate. We don't like the idea of noble families controlling a monastery. That sounds kind of weird to us. But so many of the saints of the church and good things that happened also came about from those relationships. So some of the great reforming popes were imposed on the church by powerful emperors with armies who were just fed up with the corruption. So there's a lot of it's sort of a both and situation. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yep.
Well, I just wanted to share that quote at the end where she was talking about how she thought how unfortunate it was that God had put her in the female body. And I just thought it was so intriguing because, women today have that thought all over the world.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I just could really relate, and it really, really hit me really hard. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, to see it in a text written in 1405.
Yeah.
When I was very young, I wasn't always happy that I had been born a girl. I'll admit that freely. I was a nerdy kid. I wasn't like some of the other girls in my class. I felt like something was wrong with me, and so to see something that old and someone speaking out so clearly that the problem wasn't that she'd been born a woman. The problem was that a lot of injustices toward women had been put into print, and women were believing things about themselves that were not fair to themselves or to God's plan. I think it's really striking to see. And it's when you see that in a 15th century figure, I like to make sure Catholics know that this is part of our heritage too. Even though she's not a canonized saint, she saw herself as a very devout Christian. Her daughter was a Dominican nun. She worked for, the Catholic King of France. And there's a lot of interesting women like this in history that are not canonized, that are part of our inheritance as well.
Beautiful.
Mhm.
Hi, pardon me, I just wanted to ask about, like the sources
Mhm.
for that you find, especially for, like Rhodegat, so
Mhm.
long ago. What are the sources that, are existing that you can find to learn about her?
I read most of what I learned about her from trying to see if I have it in my footnote. There are some good scholarly works. They're not widely accessible though. I don't have the footnote with me. Sorry. I have my book here. It might be here, but there is kind of a scholarly biography of her. And I'm blanking on the name of the historian who did real wonderful work in the archives with old Latin texts. I can't read old Latin, so I was not reading Venantius Fortunatus in the original. That was someone else's translation from a book I was reading. So I mean, there are you have to be skeptical, but if you do, Google is a great thing. You can find interesting little historical websites or local like web pages about buildings associated with these people that will have nice little biographical sketches. They're not always 100% accurate, so I tend to go to history books in the libraries are the best for kind of learning the true facts. But yeah, that was one reason I wrote Women of the Church, so that people don't have to spend their time going to obscure sections of libraries like I do for a living. So I think in my book I do give a footnote for the book. I just can't find it on the fly here. So but yeah,
Okay.
and different. I mean, some of the women I study, I'm studying in the original sources, and a tremendous amount is available on the web if you have a discerning eye for these things, which you train over time, and you can recognize what's a good source versus a bad source. But yeah, there's tons of scholarship on these women that never sort of trickles down into ordinary Catholic conversations. And I don't, for some reason, it doesn't always trickle down education in our schools. So that's something I and others are trying to work to change a bit, because I think history is full of so many interesting stories, not just about women, but about men we don't know that as much about either. So yeah.
Beautiful. Great question.
Hi, the last time our speaker talked about the fact that there's very little written about women in the biblical times. And she said a lot of that has to do with who's telling the story. So if men are the ones telling the story, they're not speaking of the women as much. Now you say there is a lot of documentation about women later on, like in the medieval times, but
It increases.
increases. Were most of the historians during that time also men?
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of, I don't want to question your previous speaker, but it's certainly true that is often the case with male writers. Even if they're praising women, they'll sometimes do it in ways that stereotype them instead of kind of make them seem 3D, like flesh and blood people, right? Like you can sort of praise a woman in a way that unintentionally marginalizes her in the history page, right? So if you were writing about Adelaide of Italy and only praising her gifts as a mother, right, even though she also was founding monasteries, right, that's a way of kind of accidentally, sometimes intentionally marginalizing a figure. But I will say that there's kind of there's a general truth, and a lot of feminist scholarship, and it affects the way the history of the church is written, underscores that a lot. But there are also many male writers who were doing that, were trying, really trying. And by modern times, I'm stunned by how many churchmen were really trying to preserve the memory of a lot of wonderful women. And it's modern Catholics who forgot them. It was not the churchmen of the 19th century, the 18th century. So there's a forgetfulness about women that I don't think we can always blame the men originally writing for. But there were more women writing than meets the eye. In monasteries, they tended to be anonymous. We do know the names of some, but not all writers wanted to put their names, so you don't even know the gender sometimes of certain texts in early medieval times. But yeah, most men, there were more men who were literate in writing, so that does affect certainly the kinds of stories being emphasized. And you'll see sometimes even in two side-by-side biographies of the same early saint, one written by a churchman who knew her, one written by a nun in her community. They will emphasize different things, right? Based on what they see as the most important aspect of her legacy. And it's partly stemming from their vision as in two different standpoints in the church, but also I think as men and women, slightly different things they want to emphasize. So to me, it's very interesting to see this, and we can be critical of past sources, but we can also be a little more open that maybe there are fewer bad guys back there than we think, and some were trying and maybe just didn't succeed very well at what they were trying to do to preserve the memory of these people.
Oh, Bronwen, this is Mark. I'm different. I've got a microphone, and two questions, but about the writing. What was there a significance to the fact that for St. Radigan that the nuns were learning to read and write, that they were writing at the time? You said it was the 500s, and we get a lot of stories about the Dark Ages that that there's not a lot of literacy. So is that a significant historical note, or is that, or is there a bit of myth busting that has to happen?
That women are writing that early?
Yeah.
I mean, it's fairly significant. I'm not an expert on the early church. I mean, you certainly slightly earlier centuries, some of the great women we do know about them through men who wrote about them. Like we have a life of Saint Macrina by forgetting which, she had two brothers who were church fathers. I forget which one wrote it. We know about Saint Monica, the mother of Augustine, because of Augustine writing about his mom. It's good son. But women, there are fewer women writing in the 4th, 5th century, but by the 6th century, I mean, Radigan's community is kind of pioneering in this way for women. It's fairly, and underscoring this, not that many men could write either. So more men could write than women, but it was also still fairly new in some monasteries for people to be writing texts in the 6th century and doing illuminated manuscripts. So I think this is a time where there's tremendous amount of warring and places getting burned down in wartime. And so anyone who's staking themselves out as a writer and preserving manuscripts in the 6th, 7th century, I think is a pioneer in that time. And so Radigan, I would say, is significant both in the history of women, but also just for we see a bit of a turning point there. The more monasteries and convents are founded, the more writing flourishes.
Great. I have a related question too to some of the comments Nancy had, and you had mentioned about Hildegard writing, expressing her self-doubts
Mhm.
but she still put it in writing. Some scholars believe, similar to also Teresa of Avila, seems to be very self-deprecating in her
Mhm.
writing,
Yeah.
especially in Interior Castle. But there are some scholars that think that was a tactic
Right.
by women writers
Mhm.
to be able to still get their writing published without claiming credibility, right? That there
Right.
was.
Right.
Can,
Right.
can you speak to that at all,
Yeah, I mean, that's
or do you
hopefully.
agree or disagree from your research?
I would say that is the more plausible explanation. So I was trained to kind of look for that in women's writing. So when I see language like this, I'm always a little bit skeptical. Like, is this really what she thought, or is she saying this to get away with what she says in the next sentence? So you'll see something like Teresa of Avila, also Hildegard will say, I was sick with doubt. I doubted my abilities as a mere woman, but then I had a vision and suddenly I understood the entire Trinity inside and out. And so it's like I understood all the mysteries of all the scriptural books. So it's a bit like it is partly, I think, tactical, but I was reading a scholar, and I wish I could remember the name. These may also have been things they're telling themselves because of things they absorbed about being female versus male, or being not trained in a university. I mean, you have the beginnings of universities starting in medieval times, not Hildegard's time. You don't really have that quite yet, but women were not trained in theology in a scholastic way, like in formal schools. They might train like with Jetta of Sponheim and more informally at home, but I think her doubt was both very genuine, and it may have been a tactics in her case. So, and by the way, I found the reference. I have Radegund: The Trials and Triumphs of a Merovingian Queen, Oxford Press, 2023, just 2 years ago, by E.T. Daly. So if anyone's really interested in Radegund, that's a good scholarly book about her. So,
Could you just one more time, Dr.
sir,
McShea?
say the title? Yes, it's E.T. like E.T. Go Home. E.T. Daly. I dated myself there. Radegund: The Trials and Triumphs of a Merovingian Queen. And it's Oxford University Press, 2023.
Beautiful.
E.T. Phone Home, not Go Home. See, I was a little young when that came out. Okay. So.
Question? Yes.
Sure. Really appreciated your presentation.
Mhm.
But I'm wondering, each one of these sort of snippets of a time of medieval theology and understanding culture would have perhaps a unique spirituality.
Mhm.
So for example, people pray the rosary, some people might read scripture, do Lectio Divina, that sort of thing. But what might be characteristic of maybe these different periods in which the spirituality would be consisting of X, Y, Z? What would XYZ be in that situation?
I think, and here I'll admit, my expertise is in later centuries, so I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question. But I think in my impression in Radegund's monastery, they're certainly praying the Psalms. There's a singing of the Psalms, so and kind of the basics of liturgical prayer together is key. Doing the hours together. There were writing of religious poetry by some of the nuns. Also, Venantius Fortunatus, the saint, he expressed some of his spirituality in writing original poetry and prayers, and that kind of was shared with some of the women in Poitiers. I mean, the Benedictines, Hildegard is a Benedictine, so there's a developing Benedictine spirituality that I certainly singing the Psalms and reading scripture a lot is happening a lot in her life. She was reading scripture before she was a Benedictine. In terms of the more kind of spiritual tradition, in terms of some of the prayers she was doing that brought about some of these mystical experiences, I don't know enough about her to speak to that. Adelaide of Italy, it's not quite clear because we mostly know about her deeds, because she's a ruler, she's a leading woman. So the writings about her deeds, not we don't know very much about her interior life. But as a lay woman, she was certainly attending mass a lot. and going to confession. We know that. So sacramentally, I think as a layperson, I presume a strong sacramental piety. The rosary was not in use yet at that point, I don't believe. Yeah, and Christine de Pizan, again, we know her mainly for her scholarship and her kind of more secular activities. So I don't know if anyone's done a study of the spirituality you see in evidence in her writings, but that would actually be a rather fun question to go into her writings and think about that. What do you see there? The way she refers to divine matters and spiritual things. Is there evidence she was influenced by one or another kind of spirituality? Her daughter became a Dominican. The Dominicans were kind of taking off as a leading institute around the French royal family. So yeah, she was exposed, I think, to a lot of different kinds of influences.
So thank you so much. Let's just
My pleasure.
give her another round of applause.
Thank you so much, all.
So just a few announcements. 2 weeks from now, you're all invited to gather in one of the 3 wisdom circles. These small group sessions, both men and women, to deepen your experience of this evening's presentation and offer the space to pray together, share your personal reflections, and explore how the stories of these women illuminate your own God-given gifts. The facilitators are Cami B. Craft-Mann, trauma-informed spiritual director and certified grief care specialist, Barbara Conklin, marriage preparation coordinator for St. Peter's Parish in Douglas, and myself, Mary Martin, the program coordinator for the CIC Leadership Formation Institute. If you haven't already signed up to participate in a wisdom circle, it's not too late. There's sign-up sheets on the tables. Also, on your table is a postcard about our upcoming signature event, the Gallagher Talk on October 15th. We're excited to welcome Gloria Purvis. Gloria Purvis is a nationally recognized Catholic speaker, author, and public scholar, and host of the Gloria Purvis podcast. Her keynote, The Role of Compassion in a Divided World, will offer a timely and inspiring reflection on how Catholic values can heal and unite. You can use the postcard to invite a friend. Thank you again for joining us this evening. We're grateful that you are willing to take a step in your faith journey with us. As a resource to lay Catholics and those wishing to learn more about this way of life, the Catholic Information Center envisions a vibrant, inclusive, and welcoming church where the loving, merciful face of Jesus is visible to all. Bless you. The hope of our witness is that people from all walks of life can share in the good news of God's reign with joy. We welcome your feedback or questions, and please take some time to complete the evaluation form. Thank you so much for coming. See you next time.